Laravel's configuration files are stored in the config directory. Each file within this directory corresponds to a specific part of your application, such as caching, logging, database settings, your application's core configurations, and so on. We're not going to go through each of these options and files at this time, but I recommend that you just read through some of these to get a basic idea of what's available. They are very well documented and it's super easy to understand what each setting controls. For example, the app.php file within the config directory contains the basic configuration settings for your application, such as your application's name, application environment, whether or not the debug mode is enabled, time zone, encryption key, and so on. Speaking of debug mode, app_debug basically determines if errors should be displayed on screen or not. For local environments, it's good to have this enabled and set to true, but for staging and production environments, you would want to make sure that this setting is turned off to avoid exposing errors, stack traces, and sensitive values. These configuration files, as you can see, are simply PHP files that return arrays of key value pair configuration options. The values typically use the env helper function for the most part, which gets the value for that configuration option from the environment file. As you can see, it's calling the env helper function here. We're passing the key to the environment variable, so this is the environment variable, and we're passing the default value in case this is not set. These variables are defined in your .env file located at the project root. When Laravel is installed, it automatically copies the .env.example file and creates the .env file for your local environment with some default values. As I mentioned, Laravel uses the env helper function to then read these variables to override some of the configuration options. This is very useful because you will have different database credentials between your local and production environments, and you wouldn't want to hardcode such values within these configuration files. This is why you would define them in your env file and then read them within your configuration files using the env helper function. So if we open this .env file here, we see that we have the application name, the environment, application key, the debug mode is enabled and set to true, time zone, database credentials on the bottom, and so on. If we open the .example file here, we see that we have these default values set in here, and then when Laravel is installed, it essentially copies this file and creates the env file for your local environment. And it of course updates some of these values with the proper values like the database credentials, connection, and so on. Now to accomplish this, Laravel uses .env PHP library behind the scenes, and we did cover this in the PHP series, so if you want to know more about it, I suggest to watch that episode. Essentially, variables defined in your .env file are loaded into the env superglobal variable and then can be accessed via the env helper function. Let's actually start our Tinker session and see this in action. So let's open the terminal. We'll do vendor bin sale tinker. Let's dump the env superglobal to see what we have. And as you can see, we have a bunch of variables here, but we also have those environment variables defined within the .env file. Let's now use the env function to access some of these variables, just like it's done within the app.php configuration file. Let's access this app name within our Tinker session. So we'll do env app name, press enter, and sure enough, we get Laravel. And that Laravel is not coming from the default value, it's actually coming from the env file it's set right here. Now let's try to access a variable that doesn't exist and use the default value to see what we get. If we try to get value for a non-existing environment variable, it is going to return null by default. So let's press enter, and sure enough, we get null. However, we can pass the second argument here as the default value if the environment variable is not found. So we can say some default value, press enter, and we get that value. We can also check if the environment is local, staging, or production by using the environment method on the app facade. So we can do something like app environment, press enter, and we get the current environment that is set in our app_env environment variable. If we pass the argument within this method, it is going to check if the current environment matches whatever we pass. So let's say we wanted to check if the current environment is staging. We press enter and it's returning false. If we check if the current environment is local, we see that it's returning true. We can also pass an array to check whether current environment variable is either staging or production, for example. So we can do staging production, and it is going to check if current environment is either of those that we pass as a list. So if we hit enter, we get false. If we add local to it, now we get true because the current environment is set to local. We'll talk about facades in more detail a bit later in the course, so for now just think of it as a class that acts as a proxy that allows you to make calls to the underlying class instance and its services through a simple static interface. In this case, that class instance would be the application class, because if we open up the application class and search for the environment method, we see that we have this method right here. So when we call app environment statically, it essentially just proxies this method call to the application instance. So the app facade basically just proxies the call to this method. Within this application class, you will see some other methods that may or may not be documented, which is why I always recommend to dig deeper into the source code when you're looking for answers. You will find some hidden gems that may not be documented in the documentation and can be useful for your projects. If you want to check if environment is production, instead of using this way to check if the environment is production, you can simply call isProduction method. Because if we scroll down here, we see that we have isLocal, isProduction, and so on. So we can do app isProduction, returns false. We can do isLocal, and this returns true. You can also check if the debug mode is enabled or not. So we can do something like app has debug mode enabled, and this returns true, because we can search this method here and we see that it simply gets that app debug configuration value from your app.php configuration file. In general, in Laravel, you will notice that there are many ways you can accomplish the same thing. Just like in this example, you can check if the environment is local or production by simply using the isLocal or isProduction methods, or you can simply get the environment and do the checking yourself. You can also just get the configuration value from the app.php and do the checking that way. Okay, so let's now talk about how to access configuration values from these configuration files. Just like we have the env helper function to access environment variables, we also have a config helper function to access configuration values. You can retrieve these values using .syntax, which involves specifying the file name of your configuration file followed by the option or the key that you need to access. So we can do something like config app.name, and notice app here refers to the file name, which is app right here, and then name is the key of the configuration option that we're trying to access. So if we hit enter, we get Laravel. Similar to the env helper function, if the configuration option doesn't exist, we can specify the default value. So let's say we wanted to get app test and this doesn't exist, it's going to return null. But we can specify the default value here and it's going to return default. Now, what if we wanted to create new configuration files, maybe specific for our application? Maybe you don't want to store your application related configurations within one of these files, and maybe you just want a new configuration file. So we'll create a new PHP file here. Let's call custom.php, and you can call it whatever you want. It needs to be a PHP file and it needs to return an array. So let's return some configuration options here. So we'll do option 1 and we'll do value 1, option 2, value 2. Now, of course, we can get this from the environment variables if we wanted to, using the same approach it's done in here. So we could use the env helper function to get the environment variable and set the default. But for the purpose of this example, and to keep it simple, I'm just going to hard code these values. So let's try to access this configuration option now. So we'll do config our file name, which is custom, and then we want to access the option 1, press enter, and we're getting null. That's because we have the Tinker session already started, and this file is not available to the Tinker session yet. So we just need to restart our Tinker session. So let's do that. Let's try it now, and sure enough, we get the value. Now, in addition to getting the values from the configuration files, we can also set the configuration values at runtime using the same config helper function. We can pass an array of key value pairs to this function, and that will essentially update the configuration values during the runtime of the application. So we could do something like custom option 1 equals to new value. Let's hit enter. Now let's try to get that value again. And as you can see, we have the new value. So when you pass an array of key value pairs, it essentially, instead of getting the values for those configuration options, it is going to update the values of those configuration options only for the duration of the current request. Now, alternatively, instead of using the config helper function, we could also use the config facade, which again simply just proxies the method calls to the appropriate object for the configuration. So we'll do config get and pass custom option 1, hit enter, and we get the new value that we recently updated. We can also use the set method to set the value. So we can do set custom option 1 and maybe put some other value as the value. Press enter, it returns null, which is expected. If we try to get it now, we see that it's set to some other value. Now let's end the Tinker session and start it again and try to get the custom option 1 again. We hit enter, and as you can see, it is back to value 1, which is what it's set to within our custom.php file. That's because, as I mentioned before, the change happens at runtime and only lasts for that request. All right, so let's actually now change something in our environment variable. Let's say we wanted to change our application name to something like Learn Laravel The Right Way. Let's put this in quotes. Let's try to access the application name now. So we'll do config app.name. We're getting Laravel. Let's restart our Tinker session. Let's try to get it now. And sure enough, it works. However, there are things in Laravel that get cached to boost performance. Configurations are one of those that get cached, and when they are cached, then making any changes to the environment variables will not be reflected when you're trying to get that configuration value. For example, we can use artisan config cache command to cache the configurations. Let's hit enter. The configuration has been cached. Now let's try to open Tinker. Let's get the app name. It's correct. Let's change this back to Laravel. Let's try to restart our Tinker. Let's get the application name again. And as you can see, it is still returning the previous value because now our configuration is cached. In order to get the proper value, we need to clear the cache, and Laravel has another artisan command that allows us to clear cache. So we can exit Tinker session, and instead of doing config cache, we can run config clear. Now we could also run config cache again, and what it's going to do is it's going to recache the configuration options, and it's going to take the new value. So let's hit that. The configuration has been cached successfully. Let's open Tinker again, run it, and as you can see, it's back to Laravel. Now, if we change this back to Learn Laravel the Right Way, again, this is not going to return the new value. It's going to return the previous value because configuration is cached. We can again either run the config cache to recache the configuration variables, or we can simply clear the cache. And now it's going to return the proper value. And if we change this to Laravel and restart our Tinker session, we see that now it's returning the proper value. The configuration files are no longer cached. So what happens when the configuration files are cached is that it combines all of your configuration files into a single file that can quickly be loaded by the framework. Now, it is better to not cache things locally because you will be adding and modifying configurations while in development mode. But you should really cache your configurations in production or in staging as part of your deployment process. That way your framework is optimized a little bit. Now let me show you what that cached configuration file looks like. So let's exit here. Let's cache the configurations. Let's open the Bootstrap, cache, and we see config.php in here. If we open that, we see that it's just a single file that contains a giant array containing all of the configuration options. So we have the app file here, and if we search for custom, it should be here as well. When we run the clear command, we see that this file is deleted from the Bootstrap cache directory. And as you can see, we have some other caches here, and that's just Laravel basically optimizing things to make sure your application runs as fast as possible. Now, it's worth noting that once configurations are cached, Laravel is not going to load the .env file during requests or while executing artisan commands. This means that if you try to access environment variables using the env function, it is not going to work since it will only contain external system-level environment variables. So for example, let's cache the configuration files again. Let's run the Tinker. Let's try to get the application name using the env helper function. So we'll do env app name, hit enter, and we're getting null. If we try to dump the env superglobal here, we see that it only contains the system level variables. It doesn't contain the variables from the env file like it did before. So because of this, it is advised not to use the env helper function outside of the configuration files. Because if you use env function within, let's say, your controller or your service class, it is not guaranteed that you're going to get the proper value, because if the configurations are cached, then it is not going to return the value because the environment file is no longer being loaded by the framework. But we can use the config function to get the proper values. So in here we could do config app.name, and this returns the correct value. Because again, the cached configuration file has all the configuration options and values in there whenever we ran the cache command. You should limit your usage of env helper function just within the config files. So just keep it in mind that in your application code, always use the config helper function or the config facade to basically get your configuration values or environment variables from your configuration files. Do not use the env helper function to get your environment variables. Another cool thing is that before loading your application's environment variables, Laravel checks whether the app env environment variable is set externally or if the --env command line argument is used. If either condition is met, Laravel will attempt to load your .env.app environment file if available. If no such file exists, then the default .env file will be loaded. Let me show you actually what I mean. So let's say we clone this and create .env.local, and we change this to something like Laravel local. And I'm putting this in double quotes because we have a space. Let's restart our Tinker session. Actually, before that, let's clear the cache. So we'll do config clear. Let's open up a shell here to avoid running vendor bin cell commands over and over again. So let's do that. Now let's open up the Tinker session. So we'll do php artisan tinker. Let's get the application name configuration file. And we see that it's still returning the Laravel from the .env file. However, if we try to run the Tinker with the environment variable being set before the command externally like this, and then run php artisan tinker, what's going to happen is that Laravel is going to detect this and it's going to try to load .env.local file instead of the .env file. So let's hit enter. Let's try to get the config app name again. And sure enough, now we see that it's getting the value from the .env.local file. And this is very useful because you can have multiple environment files and load them depending on your environment. Let's run the artisan tinker again without the environment variable. Let's run config app.name and we're back to the default .env file. We can try using the --env equals local. Let's try to run it now and we're back to Laravel local. Alright, now what if you wanted to configure something else, maybe something related to hashing? As you notice, the hashing configuration file is not available within the config directory. That's because while most config files are present here, some config files are not available by default. Not long ago, back in Laravel 10, there were a lot more configuration files in here, but Laravel 11 kind of slimmed down on the number of files that are available, because in most cases you don't need to change those files. But if you ever wanted to change those files, you can publish them using the config publish command. So let's exit from here. Let's clear that out. We can do php artisan config publish, hit enter, and we get this prompt where we can choose what configuration file we want to publish. Let's scroll down here and we found hashing. We hit enter and we see that it has published hashing configuration file. And sure enough, we see that file created right here. So now we can open that file and change things based on our needs. Now this command publishes configurations of your application from the Laravel framework. If you want to publish configs that are added by other libraries like Tinker, for example, you would use the vendor publish command, which publishes not only configuration files, but other vendor files as well, like assets, views, and so on. Let's hit enter. And I have a typo. It's provider, not prodiver. Let's hit enter. And sure enough, now it published the config tinker.php file. If you had another library that is compatible with Laravel and has its own config files, you would publish it using this command, and you would specify the service provider for that package. Alright, so let's go back to the environment variables and the environment file. Let me close these out from here. Let me actually delete this since we don't need it, and we don't need this either. We technically don't need this either. And let's also delete the env local. And what I want to emphasize more related to the environment files is that you should try and avoid as much as you can committing your env files to Git repository, because it contains sensitive and confidential information like passwords, application keys, tokens, and so on. There is a way to encrypt your entire env file and keep it in the repository if you wanted to, but I personally don't like the idea of storing environment files in repository, whether it's encrypted or not. You should, however, commit your .env.example file and keep it updated with placeholder values as you add more environment variables. Alright, so with that, I think we can end this lesson here and move on to the routing in the next. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you are enjoying this course and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.